A single heartbeat can stretch into forever when it holds the weight of a decision that changes everything. We capture those endless moments and shape them into cinematic stories for you. Hit subscribe now and journey into the infinite layers of human experience with us. The summer I turned 63, I set the last piece of hand-cut crown molding in what I believed was the finest room I had ever built. I stepped back, sawdust still clinging to my hair, and I wept. Not from sadness. Because I was finished. Because every knot in every plank of that old timber frame had become something I understood. The way a man knows his own pulse. By feel, not by thinking. I wiped my face on my sleeve and called my daughter to tell her it was ready. She didn't pick up. She called back 2 days later. Let me explain something before I tell you what happened next. I am not a man who asks for much. I spent 38 years as a Norwegian carpenter in the hills of Western Virginia, framing houses, laying oak floors, building cabinets that outlasted the marriages of the people who ordered them. My hands have split and bled more mornings than I can count. My knees have been worn out since my early 50s. I drove the same Ford truck for 21 years because it still ran, and I saw no reason to waste money I didn't have on something I didn't need. My wife, Elena, used to say I was the most stubborn, frugal man she had ever loved. She said it like a compliment, and I took it as one. Elena passed 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 15 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't say more about that because it still sits in my chest like a stone I've learned to carry but never set down. What I will say is that after she was gone, I needed something to do with my hands. Grief is strange like that. It either freezes you or pushes you forward. I have always been a man who moves. The land had been in my family since my grandfather's time. 56 acres outside a small place called Moss Creek, about half an hour west of Roanoke.
Hey,
Nothing
kiddo.
special. A farmhouse we used as a weekend place when Jesse was little. An old hay barn that hadn't been used for hay since the 1980s. A stream that ran cold and clear along the back boundary. And a ridgeline that faced west and blazed orange and purple every evening like something painted by an artist showing off. The barn was a 2-story post and beam structure, oak frame, likely built around 1935. The roof had leaked in 3 spots. The siding was silver gray. Inside it smelled of old hay, grease, and thyme. Most people would have looked at it and seen a demolition job. I looked at it and saw a home. I began the work 2 years after Elena died. I told Jessie what I was doing. She was living in Richmond then, working in marketing. Married to Kevin for about 4 years. They just had their first child, my grandson Lucas. I told Jessie I wanted to turn the barn into a real living space. Something she and Kevin and the kids could use on weekends. A place to bring the family, the kind of retreat her mother always talked about having one day. Jessie said, "That sounded great, Dad." She said it the way young people say things when they aren't really listening. I heard it in her voice, but I didn't say anything because I believed that once she saw it, she would understand. I worked on that barn for 5 years. I'm not exaggerating. From the spring of the year after Elena died to the late summer 5 years later, I drove out to Moss Creek every weekend, and most of my vacation days, and every day after I retired in year 4. And I worked. I put on a new metal roof myself, standing seam, dark bronze, the kind that lasts a century. I repointed the stone foundation. I insulated the walls with spray foam and covered them with reclaimed barn board from 3 different dismantled farmhouses I tracked down through salvage contacts I'd built over decades in the trade. The main floor I laid in antique red oak, the sort of wood you can't buy new anymore because the trees that produced it are mostly gone. I found it through an estate sale in Patrick County, a man who'd stockpiled it in the 1990s and never used it. 1,200 square feet of flooring that glowed like honey under finish. I built the kitchen cabinets myself, cherry wood, hand-cut dovetail drawers, no plywood, solid wood throughout. I made a dining table from a single slab of butternut I'd been aging in my shop for 14 years waiting for the right project. The slab was 9 feet long and nearly 4 feet wide, one piece with a natural live edge on both sides. I put steel legs on it, and it looked like something from a design magazine. I built a loft bedroom above the main space, reached by a floating staircase with open risers and a cable railing. The master bathroom downstairs had a soaking tub I framed in cedar and a walk-in shower with a pebble floor I set by hand, stone by stone, over 5 weekends. I added a front porch that ran the full width of the building facing west toward that ridgeline. I built 4 cedar rocking chairs for it, the same pattern Elena had always admired in a catalog she kept in a basket by her reading chair. I did 90% of the work myself. I hired an electrician and a plumber because I'm stubborn, not foolish. Everything else was my hands, my tools, my hours. When it was finished, I walked through it slowly, alone, the evening before I called Jessie. The last light came through the west windows in long horizontal bars, catching the oak floors and turning them gold. The butternut table sat in the middle of the main room, and it was the most beautiful piece of furniture I had ever made. The rocking chairs on the porch were still and perfect. I could hear the stream from the bedroom window. I thought about Elena. I thought about how she would have sat on that porch every evening with her tea and her book, how she would have made it feel like home in 3 days, the way she always did, how the grandkids would have run to the stream and come back with muddy boots, and she would have been happy about it. I stood there until dark. Then I locked up, drove home, and called my daughter. Jessie and Kevin drove up from Richmond on a Saturday 3 weeks later. They brought Lucas, who was 4, and their new baby girl, my granddaughter Maya, who was 8 months old. I met them in the driveway of the old farmhouse, and we drove the gravel road back to the barn together. I watched Jessie's face when she got out of the car. She looked at the building for a long moment. She nodded slowly. She said, "It looks really nice, Dad. That's something." I had hoped for more, but I told myself she needed to see the inside. Kevin was already walking around to the back, looking at the exterior, and he said, "Is the siding original? It looks pretty weathered." I told him it was reclaimed, intentional, part of the look. He said, "Huh." Then he looked at Jessie. Inside was worse. Not because anything was wrong. Everything was right. It was worse because I could see it wasn't what they had pictured. Or more precisely, it wasn't what they wanted to picture. Kevin walked through the kitchen and touched one of the cabinet doors and said, "The craftsmanship is beautiful, but is there an option to hide the appliances? Like panel ready? We really prefer a seamless look." I didn't know what panel ready meant in the context of a barn. I had just spent 5 years of my life on this. Jessie stood at the butternut table and said, "Dad, I need to be honest with you. I know you worked incredibly hard on this, but Kevin and I have been talking, and honestly, the feel in here is very rustic, very cabin-like, and we're more of a modern minimalist household. I mean, look at our place in Richmond." I said, "I built this for you." She said, "I know, and I really do appreciate that, but it's not really our style." I didn't say anything. I was standing next to the butternut table, my hand on its surface, feeling the grain under my palm. Kevin said, "Honestly, Walter, what if you just sold this property? Both structures, the farmhouse and this building. You could take the money and do something nice for yourself. A condo maybe, somewhere easier to maintain." I said, "A condo?" He said, "I'm just saying it might be more practical at your age." My age. I was 63. I had just built with my own 2 hands a building that would stand for 100 years. A building more honestly made than anything Kevin had ever decorated with his seamless appliances and modern minimalist aesthetic. Jessie said, "The thing is, the land might be worth something to a developer. There's been a lot of interest in this area. I've been watching the market. We could probably get good money for the acreage." I said, "We?" She said, "Well, you know what I mean." I said, "I do." Jessie took Lucas down to the stream that afternoon while I sat on the porch in one of the cedar rocking chairs and held baby Maya and watched the ridgeline go orange. Kevin was inside on his phone. When Jessie came back up from the stream, Lucas was soaked to his knees and laughing. Jessie was carrying him on her back and laughing too. For a moment I saw my daughter the way I used to see her. 8 years old, running through the yard full of something simple and good. Then she came up on the porch, and her face went back to the face it had been. She said, "We don't have to decide anything today." I said, "That's right, we don't." They drove back to Richmond that evening. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, which in that part of the mountains happens all at once, like someone flipping a switch. I rocked in Elena's chair and thought about what my daughter had said. I thought about the word rustic, the way she'd used it. I thought about Kevin asking about panel-ready options in a kitchen I had built from scratch with hand-cut joinery. I thought about a condo somewhere easy to maintain. I stayed at the property that night. I made coffee in the kitchen on the cast-iron percolator I kept at the barn. And I sat at the butternut table in the dark and thought for a long time. In the morning, I drove into town and called a woman named Paula Marsh, a real estate agent I'd known for 25 years through various clients. I told her I might be thinking about selling the barn property, just the barn structure and about 6 acres around it, separated from the main farmhouse parcel. I asked what she thought it might be worth. She drove out the following week. She walked through the building for nearly an hour without saying much. She opened cabinets. She crouched and looked at the floor joists. She went up to the loft and studied the cable railing and the view from the loft window. She stood on the porch for a long time. She said, "Walter, I need to be direct with you." I told her direct was the only kind of talk I had time for at my age. She said, "This isn't a barn conversion. This is a high-end luxury property. The materials alone, the antique oak flooring, the butternut slab, the cherry cabinetry, the metal roof. If I priced out the materials today at current salvage and premium wood prices, we're talking about a materials cost that most spec builders never see on similar square footage. And your craftsmanship isn't contractor grade. This is artisan work." I asked what she thought I could get for it. She sat down at the butternut table, put her hands flat on it, and looked at me. She said there's a market right now for what people call experiential real estate, short-term rentals, wedding venues, corporate retreats, boutique accommodations. This property with this ridgeline view, this stream access, this level of finish within half an hour of Roanoke. She paused. "I would list it at 1.6. I think we sell at or above asking." I said, $1.6 million. She said, "At minimum." I didn't speak for a moment. I looked at the butternut table. I thought about Jesse telling me it wasn't their style. I told Paula to draw up the listing. I didn't tell Jesse. Let me be clear about why the property was mine. My grandfather's land passed to my father, passed to me. My name alone on the deed. Elena and I had agreed early in our marriage that the family land stayed in my name because her family had complicated feelings about inheritance, and we wanted to keep things simple. I had never signed any portion over to Jessie. She had no legal claim to any of it. I wasn't obligated to tell her anything. But more than that, and I want to be honest about this, I didn't tell her because some part of me wanted her to find out the way she found out. Not out of cruelty. Out of the belief that some lessons have to land hard to land at all. Paula listed the property on a Thursday. By the following Monday, we had 14 inquiries. By Wednesday, we had 6 showing requests. 3 from private buyers and 3 from development groups. I agreed to 3 showings. The first was a couple from Atlanta looking for a vacation home. The second was a boutique hospitality group based in Nashville that was building a collection of luxury short-term rentals across the Southeast. The third was a private buyer from Roanoke who was a retired architect. The Nashville group made an offer on the 7th day after listing. Full asking price, $1.6 million, 30-day close, no contingencies except inspection. Their representative, a man in his late 30s named David, told me over the phone that their acquisitions team had described the property as the finest example of authentic American vernacular architecture they had encountered in 4 years of searching the Appalachian region. He said the butternut table alone had generated what he called genuine excitement internally. I told him I wanted to keep the butternut table. He said he understood completely, and they would subtract a reasonable value from the purchase price for the exclusion. I said, "You know what? Leave it. It belongs there." We closed in 32 days. The morning of the closing, I drove out to the property one last time before I went to the title company. I sat on the porch in one of the cedar rocking chairs. All four were included in the sale. And I looked at the ridgeline. It was October by then, and the trees were in full color, red, orange, gold. The kind of display that makes people drive hours just to see it from the road. I sat there for about an hour. I thought about every board I had put into that building. I thought about the 14 years that butternut slab had spent drying in my shop. I thought about Elena saying she wanted a place on the ridgeline someday. I thought about Lucas soaked to his knees in the stream, laughing. I didn't feel regret. I felt something closer to completion. Jessie called me the day after the deed transferred. I don't know how she found out. Roanoke isn't a big city, and she had colleagues who worked in the region, and property transfers are public record. She called me at 6:30 in the morning, which told me she hadn't slept. She said, "Dad, did you sell the barn property?" I said, "I did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Without telling me?" I said, "It was my property, Jessie. My name on the deed. Always has been." She said, "But I thought we talked about that being for the family." I said, "I built that barn for the family. You told me it wasn't your style." She went quiet again. I said, "You and Kevin talked about it maybe being worth something to a developer. I agreed with you." She said, "Dad, how much did you sell it for?" I told her. She didn't speak for a long time. I could hear her breathing. I could hear Kevin's voice somewhere in the background asking her something, and I could hear her tell him to give her a minute. She said, 1.6 million. I said, "We accepted full asking price." She said, "Dad, that land has been in our family." I said, "My family, my grandfather, my father, me." She said, "I can't believe you did this without even..." I said, "Jessie, I spent 5 years building that space for you and your family. I put my hands and my health and what was left of my grief over your mother into every board in that building. You drove up one afternoon and told me it wasn't your style and asked if I'd considered a condo." She was quiet. I said, "You made your decision about that property on that porch. I made mine." She said she wanted to talk to a lawyer. She said she believed she had a claim as a family heir. I told her to talk to whoever she needed to talk to. I told her I had already spoken to my own attorney before the sale, precisely because I had anticipated this conversation, and that the deed transfer was clean and uncontestable. I told her I wished her luck. She hung up. Kevin called an hour later. I didn't answer. He called twice more that day. I didn't answer either time.
Panel ready?
Let me tell you what I did with the money, because this is the part that matters most to me. I kept enough to live on comfortably for the rest of my life. I'm not an extravagant man. I don't want a boat or a sports car or a second home in Florida. I want my shop and my tools and my pickup truck and the 56 acres out at Moss Creek, where the farmhouse still stands and the stream still runs cold. I set up a college trust fund for Lucas and Maya, equal shares, irrevocable, with a third-party trustee. $450,000 split between them. They can't touch it until they're 18, and it can only be used for education or a first home purchase. Jessie and Kevin have no control over it and no access to it. It is for my grandchildren directly and only. I donated a significant amount to the vocational carpentry program at the community college in Roanoke, the same program that gave me my first real training when I was 19, because my father had no money for a 4-year school, and I had hands that were better with wood than with textbooks. I gave them enough to fund full scholarships for 8 students a year for 10 years. I requested that the scholarship be named after Elena. The rest I put in a simple index account, and I try not to think about it. Jessie and I didn't speak for 5 months. I'm not going to pretend that didn't hurt. She is my daughter. She is the person Elena and I made together and raised and loved through every stage of becoming who she is, including the parts of who she is that I don't always recognize or understand. I missed her during those 5 months. It's the way you miss a room in a house you used to live in. Not with rage, but with a dull, quiet ache. She called me in February on a Sunday morning. She asked if she could come up to the farmhouse. I said yes. She came alone. Kevin stayed home with the kids, which I thought was the right call for everyone involved. She sat at my kitchen table, the old one, ordinary, nothing special, and she drank my coffee, and she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I don't think I understood what that barn meant to you. I don't think I understood what you put into it. I came up there and I looked at it like a piece of real estate, and I said things that were dismissive and hurtful. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you didn't understand. That was part of the problem." She said, "I understand it now. David, the man who bought the property, he published about it on their brand's website. I read it. He described the joinery and the materials and what it took to source the antique oak. He described the butternut table. He said it was the kind of craftsmanship that almost no longer exists in residential construction. He said his guests drive hours to stay there specifically because it was built by hand." I said, "Your mother always knew." Jessie looked at her coffee. She said, "I know." I said, "She would sit on a porch for an hour without saying a word and feel completely at home. I built that porch for her." She said, "I know, Dad." We sat there a while. I'm not the kind of man who rushes a silence when a silence is doing something useful. I told her about the trust fund for Lucas and Maya. She was surprised, and then something in her face softened in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I said, "Because I wanted you to sit at this table first." She nodded. Before she left, she asked if she could bring the kids up to the farmhouse for Easter. I said, "Of course." I said I'd been thinking about building a small workshop behind the farmhouse. Nothing fancy, just a clean space with good light. And that when Lucas was a little older, I might teach him some basic joinery if the boy showed any interest. Jessie smiled at that. She said, "He might surprise you." I said, "They usually do." I still drive out to Moss Creek most weekends. The farmhouse is modest and comfortable, and it smells like old wood and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where people have lived simply for a long time. The stream is the same stream it has always been. The ridgeline is the same ridgeline. In the evenings, I sit on the farmhouse porch in a plain wooden chair, nothing special, and I watch the colors change. I've heard from Paula that the Nashville group has booked the barn property nearly every weekend through the following year. Weddings mostly, and some corporate retreats. David sent me a photograph a few months after the sale. It was the butternut table set for a wedding dinner. 16 people, candlelight. The ridgeline visible through the west windows in the background. The table looked exactly the way it looked the evening I finished it. I put the photograph in the frame that used to hold a picture of Elena and me at the beach the summer before she got sick. I moved that photograph to my bedside table. I put David's photograph on the farmhouse kitchen windowsill because I wanted to see it with morning light coming through. Elena would have understood all of it. She would have understood the barn and the sale and the long silence with Jessie and the reconciliation and the trust fund for the grandkids. She would have understood why I kept working through the grief instead of letting it make me still. She would have understood why, when my daughter looked at the most careful work of my hands and called it a style mismatch, I didn't argue or plead. She would have said, "Walter, a man who knows what he made doesn't need anyone else to tell him what it's worth." She was right. She was usually right. Last Easter, Lucas spent most of the afternoon in my shop watching me work on a small step stool I was making for Maya. He's 5 now, almost 6. And he has his mother's eyes and his grandmother's curiosity. He stood at my elbow and asked the name of every tool he saw. He asked why I was cutting the joint at an angle. He asked if he could sand something. I gave him a piece of scrap cherry and showed him which direction to move with the grain. He sanded that scrap piece for 20 minutes with the concentration of a man doing important work. When we went inside for dinner, he carried the scrap piece with him and showed it to his mother and said, "I made this." She looked at me over his head, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen before. Something that might have been respect or something softer than that. Jessie put her hand on Lucas's shoulder and said, "Grandpa taught you that." Lucas looked up at her and said, "He said I can learn to make a box next time." I said, "If you want to." He said he wanted to. I looked out the farmhouse window at the ridgeline and the last of the evening light catching the upper tree line, and I thought about the stone foundation and the antique oak floor and the butternut table where strangers were probably sitting right now eating a good meal, looking at the same view I had looked at my entire life. Some things hold their value no matter who tells you they don't. That's something a man learns with his hands before he learns it anywhere else.